So it's my pleasure. My name is Raj McCormack. I'm the Director of Education at the Bronx County Historical Society. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Patrick Tomlinson, who's going to give us a lecture on the history of the British West India Regiment.
Thank you, Raj. It is my extreme pleasure to be here and to present to you history of the British West India Regiment. I wanted to start by saying it is my honor to be here, and I hope at the end of this exercise you will have learned something. I intend to present for approximately 30 minutes, at the end of which anybody who has any questions, um, please feel free to ask. Now, we have this term British West India Regiment, and it's a kind of a funny name, and we ask why British West India and what implications does it have for the United States. But the regiment, or the antecedents of the regiment, was actually started in the United States. And I'll go back to this slide. These are two old colleagues of mine, old what they call warrant officers in the West India Regiment, who I met up with in Brooklyn. I'll probably try to get back to them. Next slide shows the military headgear of the old West India Regiment. And how did the regiment form? The regiment formed basically out of slaves who were offered their freedom by two colonial governors in the United States during the American Revolution. The first person to offer freedom to slaves during the conflict of the during the conflict between the British and the American forces was a colonial governor by the name of Lord Dunmore. Now, in 1775, Dunmore issued what is known as the famous Dunmore Proclamation. I'll try to find it and read it for you. But Dunmore essentially said that any slave who fled to the standard of the British would be given their freedom. So what happened is most men of color at the time went to the British standard in opposition to the American standard or the American forces, because they felt that the British would give them a better deal in terms of in guaranteeing their freedom. This is a stock photo of what the original regiment would look like when it was formed. The regiment was comprised mainly of men of color and officered by what is called European soldiers, for want of a better term. So let me go to the next slide. Here we see two members of the regiment. This would be probably like 100 years after it was formed, somewhere around the 19th century, maybe 1860, 1870, these men. So this is about the vintage of 1860, 1870. And what had happened is, after the formation of the regiment and after the cessation of hostilities between the United States, when the United States was formed, and the British, after the cessation in 1787, the British, after forming a small militia force, moved that militia force or offered them their freedom, and most of them were taken back to the West Indies. Some was taken to Canada, and some repatriated with other British regiments to the United Kingdom. So we move to the next slide. This slide you will see is taken from a extract of a book by Major A.B. Ellis called A History of the First West India Regiment. And you'll see some of the actions. Now, you notice the first title you'll see is Action at Stoner Creek in 1779. Now, Stoner Creek was a place or a major battle site in South Carolina. You see in chapter 2, he goes on to describe the siege of Savannah. So these locations are locations where the British, having formed these African or African Americans into regular fighting units, now began to deploy them in major battles during the American Revolution. You see in chapter 3, it says Battle of Eutaw Springs. And then in 1781, you see removal to the West Indies. So what the British did, as I said before, is after the cessation of hostilities, these men realized that should they remain in the United States, the chances were very high that they would be put back into slavery, especially against the background that they fought on the side of the British against the newly formed American forces under General Washington. If you have any questions, you can stop me, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. So feel free to stop me. Any questions so far? Yes, sure. Go ahead.
I was wondering, did any of them? You said that they traveled to the United Kingdom and Canada. Which parts of Canada did they go to?
Halifax, Nova Scotia, and in fact, there still exists today. But there was a bigger community in the past of African or people of African heritage or background in Nova Scotia, Halifax, Nova Scotia. And some of them were chose to go back to Liberia, the newly formed colony in West Africa called Liberia. Okay, so we can get back to this, but I just wanted to show you this. And this gives the history of the regiment um, across various decades of the 18th century and the 19th century. Now, if you look at chapter 13, for example, you will see expedition to New Orleans, which is 1814, 1815. So what happened in 1815, if you recall, there was what is known as the War of 1812. Okay, what the British did is after taking back the regiment and reforming it in several ways in the West Indies, they brought back the regiment to brought back the regiment to fight in the War of 1812 in the United States. So you had several regiments of these former men of color fighting during the War of 1812. In fact, there were two regiments that they found very, very strong records that those two regiments were very much in the presence of the White House when it was burnt in 1814, 1815. So let us move on. Um, so you see, this is later on when the regiment started moving all over. The storming of Sabaji, which is in West Africa. So the regiment also went to West Africa in chapter 25. You see the Ashanti expedition. Now the Ashanti kingdom, as you know, was a large, very strong warlike kingdom in West Africa, in Ghana, West Africa. And what had happened is that region began to contest with the British forces over dominance of minerals and gold and so forth and so on. So the British decided to take several regiments to that region of West Africa to fight the Ashantis. Okay? In chapter 26, we see right here the Jamaica Rebellion. Now, that is a very, very, very important occurrence in the history of Jamaica, where there was a major rebellion in 1865, and thousands of natives or people of color in the hills of Jamaica were killed. So the regiment was also present in those uprisings. I would like to speak a little bit about, the average. So let me go back a little bit about the average soldier, what he was. Now, when the British took these core people from the United States back to the West Indies, they formed a number of regiments out of them. They formed 12 regiments. They formed the 1st West India Regiment, 2nd West India Regiment, the 3rd West India Regiment, up to the 12th West India Regiment. So there were actually 12 regiments. We only have records today of 2 regiments, major regiments. The rest of the records of the other 10 regiments were lost, because what was happening is that the records were being taken back to Britain on a particular ship during the 19th century, and I believe the ship ran into some storm, and those records were lost at sea. So this is what the typical regiment would look like, and what the dress it would use. That Zouave uniform, the top of it is, and the headdress is a blend of French. The Zouave is really the dress is really originating in France. So, but the British adopted it and used it, and it was very applicable and comfortable to the West India situation. Now, what I'd like to talk about too is that, as my colleague here said, the climate usually in the summer months of the year can be very intense. In Georgia, South Carolina, Arkansas, Texas, even in the West Indies, Bahamas, Guyana, Jamaica. So the British realized that they had experienced tremendous losses in terms of manpower due to yellow fever and all these tropical diseases. And so they found that, based on scientific evidence, that the African soldiers, especially those who came from within the tropical climate bands of Africa, were much more able to withstand the intense summer climate than European soldiers, because the British lost quite a number of men in the West Indies. I mean, if you visit any cemetery in the West Indies, and particularly Jamaica, you will see so many graves of young European soldiers who died at very, 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 very young ages, 22, 23. When you look at it, you see the various diseases: cholera, yellow fever. And I'm sure we know what cholera is, right? Cholera is just drinking, it's a waterborne sickness that infects the intestines. Okay? And then yellow fever is something that is derived from the mosquitoes. And if the men do not sleep on the nets and so on, and the mosquitoes bite you, you develop such an difficult sickness, and at that time there was no cure for yellow fever, and so there was a lot of casualties at the time. So let me move through quickly. This is, as I said, this is the uniform. These are some of the locations that the regiment um, um, found themselves in. And let me go to this. This is actually a picture. I put it here of the Battle of New Orleans, where the regiment fought. You can see the soldiers in red, and you can see a line of formation with cannons facing the enemy, and the men are in blue. This is actually the Battle of New Orleans, which is a major battle that took place in 1815. And it took place towards the end of that major battle in the United States. Now, what happened is the British brought to New Orleans, again, several of the members of the West India Regiment. They brought maybe 4 or 5 regiments. And let me just speak a little bit about our regiment and the size of our regiment. Do we have any idea what a regiment is and what the size of it is? Go ahead, sure.
At least 200.
Yes, it's about 200. A regiment is made up of generally 3 to 4 companies, and a company is usually about 100 men. A company is really a regimental formation, and that comes all the way from the Roman army, okay, all the way up through the centuries to present day. And um, modern armies still use what is called a company. 3 companies plus support services forms a regiment itself, okay? So a regiment can be anywhere from 200 to 800 men, okay, depending on the size of the regiment. So if you have 12 regiments, you're talking about 12 to 15,000 men. So if the British had formed 12 West India regiments, we're talking about a sizable amount of men under arms. Now, what is important to stress and state also is that the British West India Regiment is called British West India because even although these were men of color, the British considered them just like any other regiment. It was called on the British establishment. So, for example, the Irish Regiment or the Northumberland Fusiliers or um, the Royal Regiment of Artillery, all these, the British had about 112, 115 at the time. And the British West India Regiment was one of those regiments. So they consider them just as good and as equal as any other British regiment. So that's why it was actually on the British regimental standard. So what happens here is that um, Andrew Jackson was the general commanding at the time, and the British forces were commanded by a young officer called Pakenham, Lord Pakenham. Now, Pakenham was a distant relative of Wellington. Now, you have to remember that 1815 is about the time we had a major battle in Europe called Waterloo also. So, what Andrew Jackson did is that he placed a very good formation right across the line of the advancing British. And on the bottom of the screen is actually what is called is the actual Mississippi River. And so Jackson really hemmed in the British, and Pakenham did not have enough fighting experience as General Andrew Jackson. The British suffered tremendous losses in this conflict, in the Battle of New Orleans. And you can see to the left of the photograph, you can see reserve regiments behind to the left of the screen. And you can see the formations of the British trying to attack the Americans. The Americans lost very little in that battle. It was one of the major battles. It's one of the major studied battles. And you see where Jackson placed all his guns. Now, what the photograph doesn't show very well is that there was a significant drop between Jackson's position and where the British were. I mean, 10 to 15 feet. Because what he did is he built what is called a redoubt. And so the British had to run up, try to attack, and to mount that parapet. And Jackson placed his guns. You can see all his guns along the line there on the parapet. And so what he did is he really, really ripped into the entire British army at the time. And so the British suffered in the Battle of New Orleans. It is estimated that it would be anywhere from 2 to 3,000, and Jackson's casualties were under 100. And from this battle, Jackson became very famous. This is what brought him a lot of fame and fortune. And thereafter, he became, I believe, the 16th president of the United States. Now, before I go on, I just want to say quickly that both sides had quite a number of men of color fighting for them. Jackson had, I mean, he had moved down from, you know, through Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and all those places. And what he did is he rounded up a lot of men of color off of the plantations and so on, and formed them into fighting forces, and also placed them at strategic points where they were very, very crucial in the defense of the United States. So even though the White House was destroyed and so on, the British experienced tremendous losses in the Battle of New Orleans. Any questions? Yes.
The regiments that were lost, did they cost a lot to be able to honor them, like with burials or with keeping records?
If the regiments that were lost, if it cost, just rephrase your question for me again.
Yes, sir. Were the soldiers that were lost, were they able to have any type of a burial? Were they able to have their names written down? And if so, was that costly?
Usually, it's not like today. You have to remember, like what would actually happen is I can maybe give you a little bit of a feel of the scene. Now, I should start by saying that I was a member of one of the antecedents in the island of Jamaica of the battle, one of the British West India Regiment. So I went through some of the history, and I've always followed it, and I've always been interested in it. Now, in any 18th century conflict, whether be it Waterloo or Antietam or Chancellorsville or New Orleans or wherever it is, it wasn't like now. You got a musket ball to your shoulder and it broke your shoulder, or it pierced under your heart or so on. A lot of men died not from the actual wound itself, It's from infections. There was hardly any what they call any support services. Support services means like medical equipment or ambulances or medics. People are trained as medics. Those are new concepts. What would happen is they would just withdraw, because that's exactly what happened. A few persons would move around with a horse or cart. They would look for the major officers, which is what happened in the case, because Lord Pakenham died in this battle, the commanding general. He died on the British side, and they would look for him or the senior officers. What they did with Pakenham is that those large sugar caskets, the barrels, they would fill it with alcohol, and they would just dump the bodies inside there and put a lid over it. Yes, put a lid over it. And then that would stay on a cart. Any senior officer, anybody who is of worth, not that the other soldiers weren't of worth, but the senior officers, that's what they would do. And then that alcohol would preserve the body, and they would take that body back to the United Kingdom to be buried.
Thank you.
But I'll tell you, the rest of the men would lie there. Some would lie in agony. What would happen in the nights? You would hear a lot of screaming. You would not want to. You would not want to experience something like that. You would hear groans of death. You would hear people calling. You'd hear people calling. Because it would the entire battlefield there would be strewn with wounded soldiers and dying soldiers, and they would just leave them in place. What would happen probably the next morning, early in the morning, daybreak? You have one of these what you call them, quote unquote grave diggers. They come, and if you have any gold, they search your pocket or anything. They tear off your clothes. You leave here in your underwear. If you have any silver, they take it off. That would be, and then ultimately, the American forces would just gather up the rest of the bodies. They'll have the most lowly people dig a large hole, and then they would just bury everybody else. So that's how it went in those days. If they could identify somebody, yes, they would have a few people coming and taking some amount of statistics, but that's how it would really work.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Come and days is gone. Oh yeah, days are coming and many more yet to be born. And I ask you, what are we gonna do? I ask you, my sister, what are we gonna do for them in this crucial time?